Hmm. There we go. Hey everybody. This is really weird. I am okay. Okay, I think this will work. I think this will work. Cool. Yeah. I'm gonna watch the Game Changers movie. This is a little awkward. This is the first time I've ever streamed. Yeah. So why am I doing this? Well, people are talking about the Game Changers. I eat a predominantly plant-based diet most of the time, but a lot of people in the vegan community aren't don't always give the science straight. We've seen that in documentary after documentary. They tend to give one side of the story as opposed to both sides. And it's not even that there's both sides. There's just science, and then there's not science, and then there's science, and then there's exaggeration of science. So, just for the record, I am going to be pretty critical. I've watched most of the film already. I've looked at several of the papers or maybe half a dozen of the major papers on which some of the major claims in the film are based, and then some of the other commentaries as well. I don't have a particular. Hey, what's up? These are for me right now. Do you want one of them? Here's. Here you can have two of them. High five. Yeah. Say hi. Hi. Say hi to the camera. All right. Can you close my door? Fat the documentary was also not one of my favorite documentaries either. If I had to compare like the Game Changers to Fat documentary, it's pretty tough. Which one I like more? They're both pretty similar to me. Anyway, let's just start the film and then maybe I need to like drink before these things. Maybe I need to like have 2 beers or something because this is strange. Or maybe I just need to get used to it. Anyway, we're going to start the film now. And maybe I just need to have a drink. Do we have any alcohol? Maybe I need to get alcohol. Aiko? Do we have any alcohol? Damn it. Alright. I'll survive. Alright, let's just watch the film. And hopefully this works. I think this is going to work. So I'm basically superimposed over the screen of the film, and I'm watching on a monitor over here. So, by the way, I'm becoming very dehydrated, and I've been calorie restricted all day, so I kind of feel a little jittery, and I'm also going to be spitting into a cup off the screen, so hopefully you guys won't notice that, and that's because I'm just trying to get the rest of the. It sounds crazy, doesn't it? Just trying to get the rest of the water off. Anyway, we're going to do this. Let's see if I tweet it. So, something I didn't even notice in the film until just now, it's really obvious, is sort of Of course, there's a female athlete, but there's a huge emphasis in this movie on masculinity. I guess the whole point is to make veganism out. I mean, because like it's all often associated with femininity, so they're trying to reverse that image by really, really emphasizing the masculine element. That's sort of part of the rhetorical approach of the film. So he says like nearly all the techniques he teaches are banned in the sport of mixed martial arts. But whenever he's saying that, he's just doing a basic an arm bar from the bottom. which is not banned, and actually none of these techniques I'm seeing on screen are banned. So they're basically just trying to make him sound harder than, even harder than. I mean, of course he's very hard. He's a UFC fighter, but they're trying to make him even tougher, more of a tough guy. Again, sort of emphasizing that masculine thing, but it's dishonest because none of the techniques they actually showed on camera were illegal. So I think that's going to be one of the themes of this commentary. So I guess I'm almost doing sort of a media studies commentary on this now, which was totally unexpected and not at all planned. So they're talking about him as a child, the mixed martial arts guy who's going to be narrating and interviewing all of the people in the film. And they're talking about how rambunctious and aggressive he was as a child. Again, the rhetorical approach of that is basically to show how much of a boy he was, how much of an aggressive boy. And that's not to say that, there's nothing wrong with boys that are like that. I was like that. I mean, I got into trouble all the time. I went to principal's office some years dozens of times, and I was really a difficult kid during elementary school and high school and all that stuff. So, and that happens to a lot of boys. Boys do have a disproportionate amount of trouble doing that. But anyway, the point is that they continue to focus on his masculinity, and that's the approach the film will take to try to make. The film is basically trying to make veganism be masculine. They're trying to erase the image of it being a not a masculine dietary practice, and that ties into the whole muscle issue and athletics issue. And we'll talk about that. Can you close the door, Shiori? Thank you. So it is appropriate that they're having an MMA fighter do the film, and as somebody who tends to eat plant-based, talking about jiu-jitsu, talking about why I can still do jiu-jitsu and all that stuff, it is sort of part of the image, right? And that's the strategy they're taking. MMA fighter, aggressive guy, talking to a bunch of aggressive guys, masculine dudes, talking about penises, etc. All of it's great, all of it's masculine. That's basically the film. The Game Changers is basically about veganism is masculine. Veganism is not feminine, right? Veganism is a dietary practice that manly men can do, and then also they have their female athlete as well in the movie, but it's mostly males. It's almost all males in this movie. So let's see if we've got any comments. People trolling me. Perfect. So now they're talking about the Hordiari, the gladiators. So that's really interesting to comment on because actually they're not Roman gladiators at all, contrary to what the film is saying. They're from Ephesus, and actually, if you listen to what the film talks about, they mentioned that I can probably talk at the same time. They mentioned that these are the only gladiators' bones that they have that are like this. Shiori, can you close the door? Thank you. So these are the only gladiator bones that they've actually looked at this from. These are gladiators' bones in Ephesus. I can't play the film in the background because I think that's going to be against copyright. Like, I can't actually show the film like the entire time. I think that's not gonna. If I did that, then I'd violate copyright. So I have to not show the film while I'm commenting on it. I actually looked at a bunch of different streams of different films that people did commentaries and reaction videos to, and nobody, never saw a single case of anybody playing the film at the same time. I'm sorry about that. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to show the time bar that'll allow you to follow along if you have some of the film. Actually, I'll switch it to the positive time instead of like the time elapsed, so that it. So I'm actually going to pause it real quick. So you've got the menu bar now. It should show up now. So now you see the time elapsed. Shiori, can you go outside? Okay, yeah, I'm going to put the kettlebell on the door now. Thank you. Close the door, please. Okay? Close the door. All right. That's my 1-year-old. She keeps coming in. So, yeah. So the Ephesus gladiators. That's the only data that they have. Those are Greek gladiators, and if you look at the original paper on which those claims were based, it's actually point out in the paper that the strontium calcium ratio, which is what they based the idea that the diet was high in plants, is actually very similar to the population in Ephesus. Meaning that it's not a special diet that the gladiators were consuming. It was a diet that people in Ephesus were consuming, and by chance, just because these gladiators lived in Ephesus, they were also consuming that diet. Let's double check that and make sure that that's correct, and I'm not spreading misinformation. And actually, I think we can. Okay. So we think we can do this. So here's one of the papers, Medical Daily. This is the popular release. Here's the PLOS One paper that's based on. Let's see if we can get the good. And then once we look at this, we're going to keep moving on because I feel like we can't do this forever. I'll actually flip the screen real quick. Okay, so in terms of carbon, people are similar. And then it says, compared to other Roman sites, the N values, the nitrogen values of Ephesus are relatively low. So it says that the Ephesus values indicate a generally minor consumption of animal protein like meat and dairy proteins. Okay. So they say that there's a minor consumption of animal proteins in Ephesus in general. meaning that these gladiators were not unique. And this is from other studies that they're looking at this. And then they use, and they actually compare the strontium calcium ratios not to other people in Ephesus, but they compare it to other people outside of Ephesus that are supposed to be somewhat similar to the population in Ephesus, which is the population that we're talking about, the gladiator population. So it says in this study, the isotopic data suggests a mixed diet with a high share of vegetables. However, this cannot fully explain the great difference in strontium calcium ratios, meaning that it's not the vegetarian diet, quote unquote, that causes this strontium calcium ratio to be so high. It's something else. And this is actually, this paper was actually, as far as I understand, Grossschmidt, the guy who they're interviewing, it was written by him. So they probably only included a part of their interview in the actual documentary because this would have been explained. But right. So they're trying to explain this in the paper, and they're saying that vegetables are not sufficient to explain it. And then they go on to talk about an accelerated calcium metabolism. They're just trying to explain it because it's not explained by vegetable intake. So they say at the end, taking all of these observations into consideration, enhanced bone mineral content formation due to intense physical training, fast strontium calcium changes due to strontium enriched food supplements, strong relation of strontium calcium of the major calcium supplier in the diet, the use of the ash beverage seems to be the valid explanation. So contrary to what was said, even though they do have a high vegetable intake, as far as I can tell in this paper, they weren't substantially different from the other people in Ephesus in the other studies as far as nitrogen is concerned. So if you look at the nitrogen levels and the nitrogen isotope levels, they were extremely similar, and we see that in this graph. Comparing the gladiators to non-gladiators, males and females, they're very similar in terms of their nitrogen 15 ratio. Right. And so that suggests that they had a similar intake of plant and animal protein, and that the strontium calcium ratio is actually the result of drinking this ash beverage that then caused greater strontium calcium ratio in the bones. What this basically means is that these gladiators didn't have a special diet because they're gladiators. They're eating things that are very similar to everybody else. And this strontium calcium ratio, which they showed in the documentary, isn't actually indicative of a vegetarian diet, because the nitrogen ratio is what indicates the proportion of animal and plant protein, and the carbon ratio, etc., which is not any different than everybody else. They're eating basically the same diet as everybody else. The strontium ratio is accounted for by drinking ash, as far as I understand this paper. So if I'm understanding this paper correctly, that would mean that the documentary is misleading about the strontium issue. Yeah, they were predominantly plant-based, but so is everybody around them. Okay. Now that we're done with that, we'll talk about this Conor McGregor thing and the Nate Diaz thing. Well, Conor McGregor actually beat Nate Diaz in another fight, but they don't talk about that. So that's an interesting component of all of this. And we're just going to keep going with the documentary because I've already talked too much. And while we're going, I'm going to keep reading about the strontium issue, and then maybe I can say a little bit more if I have some clarity.
Yes, but on a plant-based diet. Eat your vegetables. And McGregor had a field day with it.
It's fine, let's eat the meat plate. I'm a lion in there. Your little gazelle friends are going to be staring through the cage looking at their carcass getting eaten alive.
McGregor was feeding off a stereotype that was pretty much universal.
It's like a vegetarian.
I was curious to find out if there were any other examples following a plant-based diet. The first I found was Scott Jurek, one of the greatest ultra-runners of all time. Scott built his career running extreme distances over brutal terrain, conquering sports missions in his races, including the Badwater Ultra Marathon, 135 miles in California's Death Valley, with temperatures reaching 130 degrees.
I was training for Western State's 100-mile race, which is like the Super Bowl ultra-marathon racing. And that's when I was transitioning to a plant-based diet. I remember doubting myself even up to a week before the race, like we catch it and eat. But I led that race from start to finish and won it for 7 years in a row. And there was no question that the plant-based diet was killing my injuries.
When I met Scott, he was gearing up to the greatest challenge of his career.
Okay, perfect. I've got the perfect quote. It says here, in this study, the isotopic data suggest a mixed diet with a high share of vegetables. However, this cannot fully explain the great difference in the strontium-calcium ratios. Other possible reasons for the high strontium-calcium values of gladiators must be discussed. The stable isotope data means do not differ significantly between gladiators and contemporary females and males, suggesting that there are no major differences in their overall diet. And then they go on to, so that's why they need to explain it in terms of the ASH. They actually say that there's no major difference between the gladiator and the non-gladiator's diet, meaning the gladiators were just eating what everybody else was eating. Obviously, that makes total sense. Why would the gladiators be eating a substantially, radically different diet from everybody else? In general, athletes are going to eat something very similar to what the general population is eating. And in this case, that's what they were doing. So this documentary is misleading on that point. Now they're talking about Scott Jurek, this ultra marathon runner.
Having already mastered single-day endurance events, Scott was now trying to become the fastest person ever to run an entire Appalachian Trail. 2,100 miles.
My goal is to break the record, 46 days, 11 hours. It's the main. 2 marathons a day over technical training. Average of 11,000 feet of climbing and 11,000 feet of descent every day, back to back to back to back. It's completely beyond anything I've done before.
The Scott hit the trail, mostly due to that absolute diet, possibly due to enough energy. So I reached out to Dr. James Lewis, excellent physician who was part of 2 championships, a World Series, and a Super Bowl.
What I found in the locker room.
Okay, so this James Loomis stuff with the team physician for the St. Louis Rams and Cardinals, he's right. Protein doesn't give you energy. It's just it's really a substrate for building muscle.
Very much protein oriented because their perception was that protein is what sustains their energy. But in fact, that's not the case. The actual energy for exercise comes mainly from carbohydrates in the form of glycogen that we store in our muscles. And when we sacrifice those carbohydrate calories for protein calories in our diet, what ends up happening is we'll develop with chronic carbohydrate or glycogen depletion. And what does that lead to? Well, it leads to chronic fatigue and loss of stamina.
I wanted to know how this whole increasing energy thing got started, and traced it back to the 1800s.
So this whole glycogen thing, where if you don't eat enough, carbohydrates, you're gonna get like not have enough energy. You're gonna get chronic fatigue, etc. Because you're gonna have just too much protein ratio and then not enough carbs running on. If you do that, you're probably gonna get very lean. You're gonna start losing weight, and you're gonna notice that you're not eating enough calories. So this is kind of confusing. It's not like there's gonna be this mysterious thing that happens to you where suddenly you're just gonna feel all of this fatigue all the time. No, you're just gonna start losing weight, and your performance is just gonna start suffering because you're not getting enough calories. You need a certain proportion of your calories to be from carbohydrates or fat in order to perform optimally. And that's interesting. They also left out the fact that fat could also be an energy source, which probably is because of some of the issues surrounding fat and the role of fat in the diet. But I'm not sure I buy his explanation for eating too much protein. I'm not sure if anybody actually does that.
The vegetarian but vegan but prolonged exercise. These beliefs were so widely accepted, they even inspired the USDA's first protein recommendations. By the time science proved this theory false, it was discovered that hard-working muscles rely primarily on the carbohydrates found in plants. It was too late. People all around the world are reinforcing these ideas about meat and energy. But not everyone was convinced. As early as 1908, plant-based athletes started to train them first with results.
You're still sticking to your vegetarian diet, right? Originally, yes. And you find that some benefits did with it. Correctly, I wouldn't know it.
So they're doing the Carl Lewis thing.
Changed my diet to a vegan diet, and I set all my personal bests at 30 years old. And now we're currently too.
I mean, just to address the Carl Lewis thing, he went vegetarian and he set even more records and all that stuff. Sure, like, the issue isn't that on a vegetarian diet or a vegan diet you can't perform athletically at all. The issue is can you get enough protein to maintain the muscle mass that you need to do whatever sport that you're doing? And you can if you get enough protein. So this Mitchell, I don't know what her first name is, but they listed it earlier. This Mitchell woman from Australia, she says she has so much more energy on a vegan diet. Well, the question you should be asking is, what else did she change besides excluding meat in her diet? Was excluding meat the only thing that she changed and she suddenly got all of this energy? And is there any evidence to suggest that excluding meat can increase one's subjective sense of well-being or vigor or energy levels? And the answer is no. As far as I'm aware, there's no evidence that shows that actually getting rid of meat can substantially increase one's energy levels. If there is, somebody please let me know, because that would be amazing. I would cite that evidence all the time because, that would be something everybody should need to know. But instead of actually citing such evidence, they have these anecdotes. Oh, I changed, I ate a vegan diet and my energy levels went up. But again, the question is what else did they change besides the vegan diet? Did they start eating a lot of other things that are very healthy? Did they stop eating donuts, etc., etc.? And we know for sure that excluding junk food and increasing diet quality will substantially increase one's subjective sense of well-being. We know that, and you can follow this woman named Felice Jacka. She's on Twitter. She's extremely smart and a really nice person, and she's a professor, and she studies this for a living. And she's on Twitter. Her name is Felice Jacka, FELICEJACKA, and her research shows that. So, is it an overall increase in diet quality, or is it excluding the meat? So now he's talking about you need animal protein maybe to get big and strong and perform at a high level. Okay, here's the deal. Lane Norton, through his studies and other people's studies as well, but in the most elegant way I've seen so far, Lane Norton during his PhD showed that if you have plant protein at a sufficient intake to match the animal protein for an amino acid called leucine, you get the same amount of muscle protein synthesis. What this means is that so long as say you have like 10 milligrams of leucine and like 10 grams of wheat protein, but you have like 20 milligrams and 10 grams of beef protein. That means you need to eat twice as much wheat protein to match the beef protein in terms of muscle protein synthesis. So the idea that you can't get enough protein as a vegan is to get big and strong is absolutely not true. You just need to eat substantially more in order to match the leucine levels in animal protein. But if you're eating the same amount of animal protein as plant protein, you're probably not going to do as well on a plant-based diet because you're going to be eating less sort of an anabolic load on the plant diet than on the animal diet.
Again, we're surprised to discover that every single plant contains all of the essential amino acids. They're more
So they say as long as the proper amount of amino acids are consumed, the source is irrelevant for muscle mass. Well, that means they really need to talk about this. They skimmed over the fact that you're going to need substantially more plant protein to match the animal protein. And then the question is does that mean that in a diet where you match that plant protein for animal protein in terms of the anabolism, the amount of the ability to or the capacity for the food to promote or support muscle growth, if you match it in that way, do you lose the health benefits of having most of your protein come from plants? And that's a really important question that nobody wants to answer. So the question is these guys who are vegan athletes, are they actually going to live longer than their meat-based equivalent people? What is the reason that animal protein is associated with higher all-cause mortality? Is it because it's something besides the anabolic component of animal protein? Or is it the anabolic component of animal protein? And if it's the anabolic component of animal protein, then making plant protein equally anabolic will make it just as bad as animal protein. But of course, there's other reasons that animal protein might be worse than plant protein for health. And they talk about heme iron, I think, later on. So one of the really interesting things here is they're having these strongest men on the planet kind of stuff. And yet, almost nobody watching this video, like maybe like 0.1%, will actually be interested in becoming like a super strong guy, or like maybe 1% interested in becoming a super strong guy. So it's almost like this whole... So it's like nobody's actually trying to be like him. They're just using him as a symbol of basically masculinity to make people who watch the video think that, like, so long as, you know, since these masculine guys are plant-based, then I too can be masculine and be plant-based. Because it's certainly not, certainly not saying, because this guy's the strongest man in the world, I can be an incredibly strong man. Like, almost nobody who's watching this video is going to be anywhere near as strong as this guy. Almost nobody watching this video is even going to bench press 2 plates. So why do they care that he's so strong? They're never going to be anywhere close. They're not going to be a fifth as strong. It's all about a manly man can do this, therefore, you know, eating only plants can be manly. And it's really important to point out that this archetype, this sense that meat is manly and plants are less manly, and so soy makes you into a girl, or soy makes you into a soy boy. It goes back a long time. It goes back a long ways. It goes back all the way to hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherer men gorge on meat. And that's probably because meat is more anabolic gram for gram than plant protein. And in order to get as strong as this guy, you're going to have to be supplementing with a lot of plant protein. You're not going to be able to do it with just legumes. Trust me, I've tried to get strong with just legumes. You have to supplement, which is fine. It's like, I do that. I supplement. I'm almost completely plant-based. But I'm just playing sort of the devil's advocate to myself and pointing out that in the natural world, eating a huge amount of plant protein sufficient to grow a lot of muscle is not going to be possible without overeating calories by a massive amount, which is why when the ancients wrote about muscle building, Aristotle, Seneca, I remember passages from each, they always talked about how a lot of that involved basically gorging on meat, and how that was a huge commitment of time and energy to do that. Seneca would say, well, do you really want to gain a bunch of muscle? Because you're just going to have to gorge on meat. And so that's why traditionally meat has always been associated, and that is my argument, that would be why I'm guessing meat has always been associated with muscle and with masculinity, because muscle is very tightly tied to masculinity, of course, because muscle is tied to physical dominance and all these other things that have been very important in our evolutionary history for men, fighting their competitors, etc. This is great how they talk about how... So Conor McGregor says he was eating 2 steaks a day for a couple weeks heading up to the fight with Nate Diaz. And Nate Diaz is amazing, by the way. Absolutely phenomenal. mixed martial artist, absolutely phenomenal, amazing cardio. I want to be like him. Seriously, as far as my cardio, I mean, of course, I'm never gonna fight MMA, but his cardio is amazing. And so it's funny how Conor McGregor says, you know, I ate all the steaks, etc., etc. You know, I've actually been cutting with the help of some guy who helps UFC fighters get into shape. So I've been cutting my weight, and that's what I'm doing right now for my jiu-jitsu competition. I'm just kind of interested to do it just out of curiosity. And one thing that he would say is no red meat leading up to the competition. I find that very interesting. I don't know why that is. Does it have to do with endothelial function? Does it have to do with blood flow? That's a very interesting thing to look up. I'm curious if there's any science behind that. Like this whole endothelial dysfunction thing that we'll actually talk about in a moment. Does red meat perhaps cause endothelial dysfunction, reduce blood flow? And actually, that's a lot of the theme of substantial parts of this film. And let's talk about that later. I think that's important. Maybe not in this video, but we'll talk about it on Twitter or whatever. So there's a direct correlation between the meal and endothelial function. So this is why my trainer is telling me not to eat red meat, because I'm gonna tighten up my endothelium. I don't know. It's a really interesting question. I think it's a really interesting thing to look into. And he's not really my trainer. He's but he's a guy who's helped me out. He's sending messages. His name's Tyler Whalen. I think he's worked with some of the top guys in helping some of the UFC fighters make weight. And his advice has been incredible. I'm still about 5 pounds away, but I think I should get there. Okay, so now they're on to this part of the documentary where they have the animal-based burrito and the plant-based burrito. This is something where I have some open questions about what's actually going on here. So, yeah, I have some really important questions about this this is actually quite confusing to me. So it's really important to note that the guy who got the plant-based burrito on both occasions has been plant-based for years. And I think that actually may have something to do with the findings that they're seeing in this, that they saw in this sort of NF3 casual, it's not a study, but in this sort of docu-study, I don't know what you'd call it. So they have the vials with the chylomicrons in them, and one of them. So okay, they have these two vials. One is from the plant-based meal. One of them is from the animal-based meal. In the plant-based meal, you can see clear through the top layer. I think that's like the serum, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while since it's been a couple of years since med school, but the top layer is the serum or whatever is the aqueous solution. But in that layer, in the animal-based meal, they see it's really foggy. It's really cloudy. So here's my question: How come the plant-based guy won, even with eating an avocado? How come it's not cloudy? It's because, to my knowledge, just because you're eating an avocado doesn't mean you don't get postprandial lipemia. And I actually looked up a little bit about this because I was really curious about this. Like, why do you not have fat in the blood when you're eating a fatty meal? It's not like it just disappears somewhere, right? It's just because it's an avocado. It still hangs around, and it's still supposed to be in the blood. So why doesn't he have it? Well, I looked into this, and actually, if you habitually eat fatty meals, then you get this postprandial lipemia. But this postprandial lipemia is attenuated, like meaning the cloudiness of the serum. It's attenuated. That means you have less of it if you don't habitually eat fatty meals. So even if you eat a fatty meal one day, but you don't habitually eat fatty meals, you're going to have less of that lipemia. And I'm assuming that's because your muscles and your different organs are taking up that fat instead of allowing it to hang out in the bloodstream, which is similar to blood glucose. If you fast for a while, your blood glucose is going to be lower after eating a meal. Not fast, but if you are in a relative calorie deficit. So that would actually suggest that the reason that plant-based guy doesn't actually have the cloudy liquid is not because he ate an avocado. It's because he doesn't habitually eat as much fat, or maybe animal fat. Or maybe there's something else different about him. But anyway, I don't believe that result. I don't think that's true, and I think that's I would place a bet 95% sure that there's something really funky going on in that, and that's a very misleading segment of the documentary. Somebody please let me know if you have any information about that. You absolutely should get postprandial lipemia with an avocado, right? Like, if you match the fat of the other meal, you should get the same degree of lipemia. So correct me if I'm wrong. So I think she's right. Like, if you have a plant-based diet that's like a lot of really good plants, you're going to be able to recover better than if you're eating donuts and a bunch of garbage, because those plant chemicals will upregulate what's called disease tolerance, and this disease tolerance is the same thing that protects your body from damage. In the case of training. So if you're upregulating those systems and you're protecting your body from the damage, the inflammatory damage that can occur after exercise, you're going to heal faster. You're going to recover faster. You're going to recover better. But is that because you're not eating meat, or is that because you're eating a lot of vegetables? And somebody from a CrossFit website pointed out the same thing. Nina Teichol's retweeted it. I only know that because, well, anyway. So even I agree with these CrossFit people, right? Like, it's the vegetables that are helping, not necessarily cutting the meat. I don't know if actually cutting meat helps. One of the studies that they actually cite here is they talk about this hamburger. If you eat this hamburger, then you get these inflammatory markers. You get all this endothelial dysfunction, etc., etc. But if you add an avocado on top of the hamburger, then you attenuate this negative response of your body. So what that suggests is that it's not the presence of animal foods, but it's the presence of plant foods that's preventing the... Well, I don't even know. It's not that it's the presence of animal foods that's causing a problem, but it's the absence of plant foods that might be causing a problem, right? Because you probably still get a really negative reaction just eating a donut, which is a plant food, right? But if you added an avocado, if you add kale on top of a donut, I bet you'd get an attenuation of that. So maybe what the paradigm actually is it's not that animal foods cause a problem so much as it's an absence of whole plants that cause a problem. This is just a guess. It's a suggestion. I'm not sure how you would test and falsify that. If anybody has any thoughts about that, that would be interesting. I'm going to do some stretching. And it's interesting, this guy got this injury, right? And he had damage to his knees, but he spent 6 months learning about nutrition. And that makes him an expert, I guess. Like 6 months of reading. I've spent like 10 years. I've gotten medical training. I'm in a PhD program where I'm focusing on the ketogenic diet. I've been in the PhD program for several years. And I still don't think I've got it all figured out. It's incredible. He must be a genius. He must be a genius. And yeah. I need to be reading the books he's reading. So he points out that his cholesterol, his blood pressure, all these things got better whenever he went on a plant-based diet. Well, the question is compared to what, right? Is it compared to a standard American diet? Yeah, plant-based diet, especially if you're eating a bunch of vegetables, all that kind of stuff, it's going to be way better. It's going to bring all those biomarkers better. But is that because you're replacing the meat or because you're making everything else better?
My personal plant-based experiment, I went to the gym because I determined to be fit. I wasn't able to spar or wrestle yet, so I decided to hit the back on the road. At my gym, lasted 10 minutes on the road to get to a name on the wall. Only a few people could have been 20. Even at the peak of my condition, the most I'd ever got was 8 minutes. Keep it going. But on this day, I hit 10 minutes easily. Then I hit 20.
So this is kind of a really silly thing that they're doing with his ropes. You know, he's doing the ropes up and down. I don't know what that exercise is called. And he says he went for 60 minutes. He usually can't hit 8 minutes. Is that really because a plant-based diet is making him 10 times more athletic? Like, 10 times more endurance?
My diet. Couldn't get going. When I was growing up, the toughest guy in the world for me was my dad. Told me the boundary was self-defense. Was always there to help me when I got into trouble. But now, he wouldn't want to even help me.
Well, you had a heart attack. Correct. You had much in the way of symptoms prior to what you got today. No, you're looking for.
After my dad got out of the hospital for an emergency heart surgery, he got on a skateboard.
Cool.
Internationally renowned heart disease researcher.
So there's a lot of controversy in sort of the underground about Caldwell Esselstyn. Everybody agrees that he really believes in what he's doing. But there's some questions about this recent study. I forgot what it is. It's the Journal of Family Medicine or something like that, where he showed the regression of the atherosclerosis using the angiograms. There's a lot of questions about that study and questions about some of that data. That's all I know. And I would actually like to see that data, like open access to it. Nobody has actually access to the raw data. And the other thing is there's some question about whether Esselstyn's patients eating such a really low plant, like a really low fat content, and they might not be getting enough essential fatty acids. And so there's some question about the long-term healthfulness of that. I'll leave that there. Eventually, I want to do a whole video on Ornish and Esselstyn and talk about that in great detail. So he says it's not just the red meat, it's not just the fat, and it's not the cholesterol. So I got really excited. I was like, wow, they're going to talk about refined sugar and all this other stuff. But instead of doing that, they start talking about AGEs, TMAO, heme iron, heterocyclic means, endotoxin. And all these things might be really important mechanisms for explaining why there's a relationship between animal products and higher mortality, higher cardiovascular disease risk, etc. So, but there's also a lot of other aspects of the diet besides animal products that are really important for mortality, and that's one of the things that's kind of bothersome about this whole documentary is that it doesn't actually talk about all that. It just talks about meat, and if you're replacing meat with a bunch of like vegan junk food, I'm not actually all that convinced that you're going to see any benefit at all. And that's what the Epic Oxford study would suggest, is that the vegans and the vegetarians who eat reasonably well, compared to the non-vegetarians who eat reasonably well, there's no difference in mortality.
When the protein found in animal foods is cooked, preserved, or even just digested by a gut bacteria,
So how important is it in the big picture of everything that's important for health in the diet? How important is the presence of meat or the absence of meat? And I'm not sure that that's well understood. Is it 5% of the equation? Is it 10%? Is it 50%. This documentary paints it to be like, I don't know, 80%, 100%.
There was improvement in blood flow and a heart began to pump blood more normally. After a year, even severely clogged coronary arteries began to and even more improvement after 5 years. But in the randomized control group who were doing just what their doctors told them to do at the time, less red meat, more fish and chicken, no exercise, and so on, their arteries got more clogged after 1 year, and even more clogged after
And the issue with making it 100%, of course, is like, or implying that it's 100%, is that you're going to make everybody think that they figured out what's the cause of all health problems, and actually you're distracting from a lot of the other really important things that people could be doing for their health. And they explicitly do that in this documentary later on. They're going to show the people sitting at the table, the athletes sitting at the table. I think they're on the Titans. They're going to show them eating basically vegan junk food. Is that healthy? And so I'm worried about documentaries like this basically encouraging people to eat vegan junk food. Because I don't think that this documentary at all warns against that. And how is that helping people's health? So Rip Esselstyn has a really interesting paradigm and way of understanding and sort of framework for thinking about food, and he's very whole food plant-based, and that's great. I think that's great. I think a whole food plant-based diet will be better than the standard American diet, but they don't emphasize that aspect of Esselstyn's program. It looks like they're tending to emphasize the presence or absence of animal products, and I think that's why this documentary is really problematic. So they're just talking about I don't even remember. I don't even know the hosts or the narrator, whatever. I call him the narrator. I don't know the narrator's name. Wilkes, right? They're talking about him and his dad. Wow. So Lucius Smith, they're going to talk about this, is like this former cornerback for the NFL who's a black belt in jiu-jitsu. He's shredded. And they're just going to talk about he's on a plant-based diet. He's been on a plant-based diet for 10 years. He is huge. He looks great. .48, 47 is a great heart rate for some guy that age. Mine gets down to like as the lowest to maybe 40, but during the day it's 47, 48, so he's in great shape. But he's basically saying he tires out these young guys who come in, and he's attributing it to his plant-based diet. It's obvious that this guy is in incredible shape, so he's probably in large part just wearing these guys out because he's in incredible shape. I don't think there's any evidence. There's no hard evidence in athletes that a plant-based diet improves athletic performance to such a degree as they're talking about, or even to any degree at all. So it's just like they're using anecdotes to make these arguments, which it's nonsense, right? because you can always find, you know, it's the Sean Bakers and I like Zach Bitter a lot. I like him a lot. I think he's a really good guy. But you can always find the Sean Bakers, the Zach Bitters of the world who only eat meat, and say that that's what causes their amazing health. And of course, Zach doesn't only eat meat; he also eats tubers and other things. But he eats a lot of meat. And so, which anecdote are you going to go with? Are you going to go with the keto anecdote, the carnivore anecdote, or are you going to go with the vegan anecdote? Well, that's why we need research, because research systematically compares these things in a rigorous way. And neither of these claims are supported by the research of, you know, meat's going to make everything great. I mean, or being plant-based is going to make everything great. I will say that, again, for the same gram per gram meat, animal versus plant protein, the animal protein will be more anabolic. And so you're going to need more plant protein to match that. And you can match it. But if you're just sort of casually following a diet, you're almost certainly going to get more of what I would call an anabolic load from an omnivorous diet than you will from a plant-based diet. If you're being very casual and you're not like being very careful and conscious about making sure you get enough plant protein. So most people on your average typical vegan diet will have less anabolism, less muscle growth in response to training than people who are on your average omnivorous diet. I think that's a very defensible claim, and I think I could easily defend that. And that's actually been shown by cross-sectional study in females. Richard Wrangham's awesome. He's like one of my favorite anthropologists. And so Wrangham pointed out that one of the things, you know, you've always heard the hypothesis that, and there's this book called Catching Fire by Wrangham. It's actually an audio book as well. It's amazing. Everybody should read that book. And it makes the argument that the increase in brain size was not due to meat, but it was due to cooking, and which cooking allowed human beings to release or unlock the energy stores of plant foods. Because once you can cook them, you can break down all that cellulose, you can break down all of those things that force you to chew for an extraordinary amount of time. And then you're going to get access to that immediately. So you can replace all of that gut anatomy, which you have in the apes and in the chewing anatomy, and all of that energy that's required to maintain all of that, and then you can put it into the brain instead, evolutionarily. So that milestone unlocked the capacity for more brain development. So that's one theory of why human brains got so big, and that's why Richard Wrangham is very interesting. And so that suggests that the somewhat shortened GI tract compared to, say, gorillas or other herbivores is not because we're carnivores. It's because cooking made it so that we didn't need as much processing machinery to process our plant foods. And that's not to say that we didn't eat a lot of animal foods. We do eat a lot of animal foods, actually, and the hunter-gatherers certainly do. But it suggests that this somewhat attenuated GI tract anatomy and physiology is not the result of carnivory. It's the result of fire. So you can't really compare humans in that respect to carnivores or any animal. Because we break the rules because we have fire, and that changes the evolutionary relationship between the structure of our GI tract and its function compared to other animals. And then they're also pointing out, and I think this is correct, that herbivorous dentition. I'm going back to my physical anthropology coursework. Our our dentition is not like carnivores. It's like a herbivorous dentition. I mean, you look at our teeth; they're not carnivorous. It doesn't look like your dog's teeth, and I think that's correct. But again, that doesn't mean that we're not carnivores either, right? I mean, that doesn't mean that we don't eat a lot of meat either, because if cooking unlocked or broke the relationship between digestive anatomy and its function and made humans follow different rules as other animals, then it might also have done the same thing with the teeth and with respect to meat. So we don't need necessarily carnivorous dentition in order to be meat eaters in that case. So the point is because human beings cook, that breaks the rules on trying to draw conclusions about our GI tract anatomy, and it breaks the rules in being able to draw conclusions about what diet we should be eating based on our GI tract anatomy. I hope that makes some sense. Okay, so now they're talking about B12, and now they're going to this ideology about, okay, if we were back in our ancestral period where the water was clean and we just drank from the water, and then when we ate the vegetables there's still dirt on it, and then we got all this B12. Then we wouldn't need to eat meat. Okay, first off, I've actually looked at the literature on the concentrations of B12 in like water that like is in lakes of dirty water, and the highest B12 concentrations do not come anywhere near to the RDA for B12, unless you drink like 30 liters, like a huge volume. That's been. I'll actually repost this analysis that I did about this. I was responding to Michael Greger. This is one of Michael Greger's points, that vegans could just drink from the water in the ancestral condition. They didn't need to eat meat. I'll repost this analysis and all the documents I found on this. If anybody has a study that actually shows that that the B12 levels in wild water and soil, etc., can be high enough for humans to actually survive, please let me know. I'd love to see that, because that's not been what I found. And so it's important to note that they didn't actually cite a study to support that claim. It's just sort of this thing, oh, in the past, we would have been able. It's just a just so story to justify their ideological position, but it's not supported by any evidence that I'm aware of. So whenever anybody makes that claim, just ask them, like, where do you get that evidence that we can actually get that? And so, in fact, if you look at hunter-gatherers, if you look at almost every single society that's ever been studied, they all eat substantial quantities of animal foods. In very differing qualities, but all substantial quantities.
When I was 4 years old, my dad, my mom, and my big sister were 4 months old. They were only my mom was. But when I was young,
It's just strange how they show this guy lifting a car. It's like none of us are ever going to lift a car. Almost none of us are ever going to lift a car, or even try to lift a car, right? So why do they need to show him lifting a car? Well, the idea is to like show, oh, big strong men, you know? Like vegans can be big strong men too. So don't be afraid to be a vegan. That doesn't mean you're not a man. And just be aware of that messaging. This is intentional. There's no reason to show that. None of us are going to lift a car ever, or have aspirations to do so. And so I love this part with Arnold where he talks about the marketing around meat and manliness, and that's true. All that stuff around meat and manliness, that is a way to sell meat. And that is a way that people are being manipulated to buy meat. But it's also important to note that this documentary is a way to do the opposite, and exactly using a lot of the exact same tactics. So it's yeah. And this was produced by Arnold or directed by Arnold, one or the other. I think it was produced by Arnold. He said that's marketing. That's not based on reality. Well, what So he knows that, of course.
Endurance, sexual prowess, fertility. That what the scientific studies have shown is that the more meat, the more quickly they lose their energy. The blood test.
So he says the more they eat meat, the more quickly they lose their manly manhood. This blood flow study is really interesting, actually, even though it is, again, it's all tied into that rhetoric of, eating vegetables doesn't make you manly, eating or it doesn't make you unmanly, eating meat makes you unmanly. So they're going to do this penis study where this the blood flow. I think this is really interesting what they did. I don't have any explanation for this, and maybe it's true. That would be really cool if that's true. But again, like, does it matter? Like, just because you have fewer erections at night, does that mean that you're going to have less function of your penis, be able to have fewer erections as you get older just because you eat more meat? Those two things don't necessarily imply each other. Because those are two separate processes, right? One is a temporary process that reverses once you eat a plant-based diet. And the other is a permanent process whereby you're basically your penis becomes clogged. Your penis, your vasculature, your blood vessels in your penis become clogged over time, and that's not really reversible through a plant-based diet. I guess one of the questions is if you have erectile dysfunction, and probably that means you also have heart disease, atherosclerosis, because they're the same thing. They're closely related, erectile dysfunction and heart disease, because they're the same processes going on. You're basically getting dysfunction of your blood vessels, and they're getting clogged up, to use that phraseology. It's imperfect phraseology, but it works here. Those are closely related. So, but the question is okay, so if you go to a plant-based diet, if you have basically atherosclerosis and heart disease, will that make your erectile dysfunction better? And I don't know if that's been shown. I think that study's being done right now. So that would be great. And if they show that, that would be another treatment that we could have for helping people with erectile dysfunction. And that would make sense based on what they're showing here. So I think this is cool. Like, it's kind of the most superficial, I don't know if it's the most superficial, but it's one of the very superficial aspects of this film. But, it helps people if we could actually give people a plant-based diet and help them with that. And I would be interested in understanding the relationship between this endothelial dysfunction. I think what is the narrative that's going on here, or the it's what's implied here. Those endothelial dysfunctions, you're getting fewer erections. What is the relationship between that and cardiovascular disease? And that's something that in the cardiology community is still debated. I don't think it's a mainstream notion. Well, it's somewhat mainstream. I'm not sure. I'm not knee deep in it, but there's a lot of people doing research on endothelial dysfunction caused by fat. What are we going? Oh wow, Zach Bitter's here. I was just gonna. I'm gonna write a few things to people who have written so far, and I'm gonna pause real quick. So. I guess I could just even talk. I don't have to type. Why am I typing? This is the first time I've done this. So, but I'm just going to finish. Yeah. And then... Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Yeah, so I don't know if I finished that thought. What is the relationship between this endothelial dysfunction stuff and actual cardiovascular disease? And I think that's contentious in the cardiology field. I mean, I've talked to like really intelligent people at prestigious institutions and people who are very honest, who question that there's a relationship. Because if there was a very clear relationship, then there would be no question that fatty meals should be avoided. And that's where the whole Esselstyn-Ornish and all this stuff comes from, the fat reduction stuff comes from, because fat almost universally causes, I mean, not almost universally, there's different kinds of fats, but many kinds of fats cause endothelial dysfunction. So that would mean that all those kinds of fats would be atherogenic. And that's questioned by a lot of people. And we're not just talking just like saturated fat. There's a lot of unsaturated fats that also cause endothelial dysfunction in terms of reduced blood flow, which confounds our whole theories on fat and lipid management and reduction of cardiovascular disease risk and the epidemiology and all these other things, because there's a lot of fats that are associated with lower cardiovascular risk. So why would these fats that can cause endothelial dysfunction also cause cardiovascular disease when they seem to be associated with lower cardiovascular risk? So there's a real big debate and discussion about endothelial dysfunction in fats, and that's something I would really like, and it's something I'm going to have to talk about whenever I talk about Esselstyn, or whenever I do my critiques. I'm going to have to look into it in a really deep level. And there's a lot of serious people who think it's serious, and of course the vegans always think it's serious because, you know, especially the Esselstyn types and the Ornish types. So this stuff on meat and cortisol is interesting. I would like to actually look it up. Wow. See, LifeSci. Let's look this one up real quick. This cortisol and testosterone stuff, where like you get lower cortisol if you eat a plant-based diet, you get lower testosterone if you eat meat, and higher estrogen if you eat dairy. Like, where is this coming from? And so they have this study that they linked, and that's good that they're linking these studies at the bottom. It's very 2019. I think that's really cool that they did that, so you can actually look things up that they're saying. That's the best I got. LifeSci. There's not even, I think it's here. No? Maybe if we just add in cortisol. Maybe it's a 1987 study. So let's look this up. So protein carbohydrate ratio alters reciprocally the plasma levels of testosterone and cortisol. So I've read this in another, I'm not sure if this is the study I've read this in. There's another study, or it's this study, that shows that higher protein levels are actually associated with lower testosterone levels. But that's not... You see how they do this? You see how they mess with the data here? Look, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the animal products. It could just be the macronutrient ratio. And yeah, I believe that as your protein level goes up, your testosterone goes down. That doesn't mean it's not going to produce better body composition. So it's a really weird interaction going on. So let's go look real quick. Testosterone concentrations in 7 normal men were consistently higher after 10 days on a high carbohydrate diet than on a high protein diet. I think I've seen this study before. And were accompanied by parallel changes in sex hormone binding globulin. So that's weird. So so testosterone levels were significantly higher, but so were sex hormone binding globulin levels, which means that the question is free testosterone higher, or is, because free testosterone is the important thing. That's what allows the testosterone signaling to happen. Because if testosterone is bound to sex hormone binding globulin, then it's not going to enter the cell and cause changes in gene transcription and gene regulation, and it's not going to cause the androgenic effects of testosterone or the anabolic effects of testosterone, because it's going to be locked up. Basically, if you have a lot of sex hormone binding globulin, you're locking up your testosterone. So if your sex hormone binding globulin increases on a high carbohydrate diet as testosterone increases, you're also going to get, you might not get any change in free testosterone, which means that the effect is negligible. In this case, it's almost like a 50% increase in sex hormone binding globulin, whereas you're only getting like a 25% increase in testosterone, which would suggest you're actually getting less free testosterone in response to carbohydrate. It's not these. I'm just reading the study and interpreting as the devil's advocate, because I would love to see like carbohydrate like win, because I would love to see vegan diets win. Like that's my like I would love to see vegan diets be better in every way. Truly, this is my honest view, because I think that would be better for the environment, like be better for animals, all these other things. But I'm just telling you what the actual data says, because I'm a scientist first, and I'm like somebody who likes plant-based diets second. That's my mentality. So let's look further at this. And okay, it's important to note that's why they're reporting the sex hormone binding globulin changes, because free testosterone is important, and they know that. So let me go take away some of the blockers here on the paper, so that we can all see this paper. Let me see if I can I can clear the layer. Actually, I need to move the image here, so I need to move this thing out of the way. How do I move that out of the way? I'm using Sci-Hub. I'm not using Sci-Hub. I'm not using Sci-Hub. I'm not using Sci-Hub. This is just, it's my background on my computer. It's not Sci-Hub at all. I'm going to make my video image smaller. I'm going to move that up, and you guys, this is all going to change at once for you guys real quick. And then I'm going to download this paper. I have access to this paper at school, so I don't know what the legal status is. I'm live streaming, so we're going to I have access to this paper at school. So I'm going to now take out the thing, and now we're going to be able to look at the paper together real quick. Before we move on real quick. We should be able to do that. Okay, so that's why they put the sex hormone binding globulin right after talking about testosterone, because they know that free testosterone is important, not total testosterone. So they say cortisol concentration were consistently lower during the high carbohydrate during the high protein diet. This is about 25. Yeah, I would love to talk about. I'm looking at your guys' stuff. Flow mediated dilation. Oh well, that is such a crucial topic, and that's going to be something that's going to be really big that I want to talk about coming up like over the next year, because olive oil, as everybody knows, the Esselstyn crew, they think it's such a big deal, and we really need to talk about that, because that really goes against the consensus among scientists, and working that out and explaining why the Esselstyn people are wrong or what points they actually have is going to be a really important issue, because there's just so many Esselstyn followers, there's so many Ornish followers, especially on YouTube. I mean, there's a huge community of people who are in the low carbon keto community aren't aware of, that really think fat is the devil, just like the keto community thinks carbs are the devil. So olive oil flow mediated dilation, that's huge on the agenda in the long term, especially over the next year or two. I want to look into that, and I want to talk about that. But anyway, we're talking about okay, so we see the testosterone sex hormone binding globulin changes. They're happening in tandem, so is free testosterone actually increasing. Let's look for the paper. Free testosterone. So they don't actually talk about free testosterone, so it's kind of this is an old paper. So if they're using such an old paper to make this point, and it doesn't talk about the things that are really important, namely free testosterone, I think it can fairly be, because they probably had a bunch of scientific advisors on this movie. It's almost certainly the case that There's no better study than this, and therefore it's almost certainly the case that nobody actually has a study that's looking at free testosterone that has actually shown an effect. So I think we can infer, not with 100% certainty, but we can infer with a 90%, 95% certainty that there's probably not a study that shows a free testosterone increase whenever you increase carbohydrate versus protein. That's what I'm going to infer from the fact that they didn't talk about this. Okay, so interestingly, the cortisol goes down faster than the corticosteroid binding globulin. So that would suggest that free cortisol is actually lower. Yes, free cortisol is actually lower in the high carb group than in the high protein group. So that would be an interesting finding. I don't know if that's been replicated, and I don't know if that's due to chance, because look, there's only 7 people. So can you infer from just 7 people that that's the case? If I was making this movie, I would say, let's find a study with 200 people, or with 50 people, or with 30 people, and let's find the same result. And I would post that. And the fact that they're posting this study with just 7 people suggests to me that the evidence doesn't exist, which suggests to me that this conclusion is based on weak evidence. Only 7 people is not good enough, especially if you're trying to draw conclusions about free cortisol as opposed to just total cortisol. So there's no free cortisol, there's no total testosterone, there's no free testosterone reported in this study. Therefore, I'm not sure we can really infer much about testosterone activity in people eating a high carb versus a high protein diet, or cortisol activity. So I'm not really sure we can infer anything from this. Okay, let's go back to the documentary. Move my image, move my face down at the bottom. This is the first time I've used this software. I think I'm doing an okay job. And I'm now in front of the movie. Okay. So then we need to remove this down here, and we start. There we go. Okay, now they're talking about this bodybuilder who looks amazingly jacked. Like, I don't know what his name is. He's this blonde guy. He looks amazing. Okay, it's an anecdote. So basically you can, okay, so the idea is you can be jacked, a huge jacked bodybuilder, and be vegan. Sure, you can. Because if you just eat more protein, you're going to get enough amino acids to support your training. Okay, there's this really interesting study they had on a ketogenic diet versus a high carb diet. And they showed that the high carb diet grew more muscle. But if you actually look at that study, and it's with Vargas et al., and you can actually look at it whenever you look at the documentary, there's this. It actually shows that the ketogenic diet people actually lost weight as well, while the high carb people gained weight. So yeah, if you're at a calorie surplus, you're going to gain muscle mass. And if you're at a calorie deficit, you're probably not going to gain as much muscle mass. So that study doesn't actually really show anything. You need to match the calorie intake between those two to actually show that if you're in a calorie surplus, you're going to gain less muscle on a ketogenic diet. And I don't think that's ever been shown. So maybe all those people on a ketogenic diet need to they just need to eat more. And they would have gained, And so the question is do you want to gain weight or do you want to lose weight? Do you want to gain muscle or do you want to lose muscle? And what are your goals at any given point in time? At this point in time, do you want to lose overall weight? If you're going to lose overall weight, you're probably not going to gain muscle. If you want to lose overall weight, then maybe if you're strictly adherent to a ketogenic diet, it might be easier for you. And the reason for that is that ketogenic diet produces greater satiety, probably because ketone levels, and it affects hormone signaling, appetite hormones, particularly leptin. Leptin's a big one, and ghrelin as well. Yes, that's been shown in several studies. Although there's some contradictory findings in some of those hormones, but overall, the studies overwhelmingly show an appetite hormone benefit for a ketogenic diet. So, but the problem with that is adherence, and people in the long term don't adhere to a ketogenic diet on average. So the question is always one of adherence, and I talked about this earlier with on my vegan gains video. vegans only adhere to their vegans and vegetarians. Only about 16% of people who have tried a vegetarian or vegan diet have actually adhered to the diet in the long term. So about, I think, 10% of the U.S. population has tried it, and only about 2% of the U.S. population not a part of this 10%. So another additional 2% is remaining vegan or vegetarian, according to the Fonalytics study. Okay, so now they're having the team gather around the Titans. These plant-based guys who are in the Titans gather around the table eating vegan food. And so if you're a big whole food plant-based diet person, this should be appalling to you, because this food is not gonna be good for your cardiometabolic health. It's a lot of junk food, which supports my point that I keep making towards whole food plant-based people again and again, that a lot of people who are going to listen to these vegan videos or the vegan podcasts or watch the vegan videos or the vegan documentaries are not going to be eating a whole food plant-based diet. We know in populations of people who eat a vegan diet or report themselves as being vegan, they're not eating a diet that's substantially different than the standard American diet in terms of, say, fiber and a lot of other things. They're eating a lot of processed foods, very similar levels to a non-vegetarian, non-vegan diet. And even in places like Oxford, where vegans and vegetarians tend to be very highly educated, they're some of the most highly educated vegans and vegetarians in the world, they're still eating diets that are very similar in terms of the fiber intake to the non-vegetarians, non-vegans. So this just reinforces that point, because they're trying to market vegan and vegetarian diet as being this really delicious, basically junk foody diet. So I don't think that that's going to produce a big impact. And again, in the Oxford Epic Oxford study I'm talking about, where they showed dietary intakes were not much different, mortality is not much different. So what's the point of this? Is this really going to help you with health? It might help you with your erections. It might help you with blood flow, maybe this flow-mediated dilation stuff. But is it going to really help you with mortality? And now they're going into this conspiracy theory area, where they're comparing, which is what everybody does. Every documentary talks about cigarettes, right? Every documentary talks about how food is just like cigarettes. Like, vegan food is just like cigarettes. Meat is just like cigarettes, and now the meat industry is trying to obfuscate the truth. Or sugar is just like cigarettes, now the sugar industry is trying to obfuscate the truth. Or GMOs are just like cigarettes, they're trying to obfuscate the truth. Or glyphosate is just like cigarettes, trying to obfuscate the truth. And it's just industry, and so the narrative here, the rhetorical trick that all these documentaries are using whenever they talk about, they make the cigarette analogy, is the narrative is, the reason you guys don't know about all this is because there's a conspiracy to keep you from knowing about it. And all those documentaries can't all equally be true, right? Like, all the documentaries can't equally be true that a vegan diet, that the establishment is trying to prevent you from knowing about a vegan diet through a conspiracy, or the establishment is trying to prevent you from knowing about a low carb animal-based diet through a conspiracy. These are actually mutually exclusive conspiracies. So what I say is we need to actually talk about the data, the science, but of course this study doesn't actually address the science, right? And we've seen that as we commented about this. They try to address the science. So they're just showing a bunch of studies, like, over and over again, just reeling these different studies that are showing that that meat is associated with mortality. But you can do that with a low carb study too if you want to. Like, you can do that with a low carb documentary if you want to. You can do that with any kind of documentary, post a million different studies, because there's studies that support everything. And it's not because there's conspiracy that you're not hearing about this. It's because scientists are disagreeing about this. Okay, now they're talking about this Glantz guy, Stanton Glantz, and the stuff that he did. And he's at UCSF. He's in the Department of Cardiology or something like that. He's an engineer by trade, by training, but then he ended up going to cardiovascular disease research, if I'm not mistaken. and I think he was really important for pointing out the conspiracy about cigarettes. But then he also recently, as many of you guys know, pointed out some conspiracies about, not conspiracies, but basically he showed that the people who penned the documents that showed that sugar, the documents that suggested that sugar wasn't a problem but fat was. I think it was who was the big guy on that? You guys probably know. He says, was it Stamler? It was a really big name that I'm missing, and it's kind of embarrassing. Anyway, they made this big review. I think it was before the dietary guidelines came out, like during the 70s, and it was commissioned by Big Sugar. And Big Sugar was like, "Hey, can you please write this, document?" And they're like, "Yes," and they were paid tens of thousands of dollars to do it. Well, they're only focusing on the tobacco part. They're not focusing on the sugar part. And sugar isn't a big part of their documentary here. Meat is. And I just think it's interesting how different documentaries that focus on different aspects of food and have different paradigms are sort of including some facts and not including others. They're not focusing on the fact that the sugar industry tried to make fat look bad and sugar look good, which is kind of against the beliefs of a lot of these people in this particular film who think that, who are behind this film, who think that fat is bad and sugar is not as bad. So we have David Katz coming on. I agree with him that like the healthiest diets tend to be plant predominant, but that doesn't that doesn't mean that you should go vegan, right? That doesn't mean plant-based diet in terms of like quote unquote, because all of those blue zones populations that Katz is talking about are all they all eat meat, they all eat animal products, right? So and David Katz is open about that as well. We could talk about controversies about him, but we're not going to here. Because Katz has supported sugar, right? He supported sugar in court cases before against people who like Lustig. He actually testified against Lustig, and I think a yogurt Chobani trial where he testified that sugar wasn't a problem. Is sugar a problem? Is sugar not a problem? Sugar is part of the problem. But he suggested that added sugar wasn't a problem at all. Anyway, there's a whole big discussion about that. But it is kind of weird how sometimes we end up in this situation where it's like sugar's bad, no fat is bad. And it's like we can't accept that there might be more nuance than that. Like sugar's bad or animal products are bad. Well, maybe both sugar and animal products are bad. But the problem with that is if you try to sell that in this movie and you tell people they can only eat kale and beans and all that stuff, then you're not going to be able to sell a vegan diet. So then they choose to sell the junk food version, and then the junk food version ends up being the version a lot of people eat, because the whole point is not about, in my opinion, the whole point here is documentaries like these are not, it's not ultimately about making people healthy, it's ultimately about getting people to stop eating meat. And if they were just honest about that, that would be nice. I don't know. Maybe I don't think I'm being too harsh. I think that's probably right. I mean, if you follow the logic, right? Why would they? Yeah. So anyway, there's this guy out in Africa. He's a badass. He attacks poachers and stuff, and so they're showing him because he's a man's man. So if you eat a plant-based diet, you can be a manly man. So this is what bothers me too. Is like they're saying that you don't eat meat to get protein, but people should know that if you eat the same amount of plant protein, or even if you eat less, which would be even worse, your muscle mass probably over the long term is not gonna be. You're not gonna have as much muscle mass over the long term, and that's really important for people to know because frailty, sarcopenia, low amounts of muscle mass are a risk factor for many diseases, especially as you get older. So if you don't include that in a documentary about this and be like, well, yeah, plant-based diet's great, but you should also be really focused on making sure you get enough protein. You should eat enough beans. You shouldn't eat low protein plant-based diet. Then you're going to put a lot of people at risk for disease later in life. Frailty. I agree with the stuff about the environment. I think the environment stuff is right with regard to plant-based diets. It's like, so livestock is going to take up a lot more land, and if we ate less livestock, we could free up a lot of that land and reforest, for example. And reforesting would be great for climate change. So that I think that's a good argument for a plant-based diet. Also, it would prevent forests from being destroyed. The reason all the forests are being destroyed in the Amazon and in South America is so that they can grow meat, soybeans, and then they can produce meat for Latin America. We don't eat a lot of Latin American beef in the United States, contrary to what some of the narrative is. But overall, everybody in the world, if we ate less meat, it would help global warming. In the West, it's less clear that that's the case, I think, because we've already deforested. So I guess the question is if we reforested, would that be a big carbon sink? And the estimates that I've heard of and read so far don't suggest that, but then there's a couple authors that I don't know. I'm a little confused about that area because that's not part of the mainstream consensus in science, but that might be changing. I'm not sure though. I know the IPCC makes it out to be that eating less animal protein is not going to help that much in the United States. It's really an issue of the developing world. But if we could reforest, maybe it could be a bigger issue. Maybe the IPCC didn't take that into account. That's one thing I want to learn more about. Yeah, so they're saying agriculture is like the biggest silver bullet. It's like the solution to global warming. That's completely false. It's completely false. So I think that's really irresponsible to say things like that because it's really only going to be, even globally, it's only going to be a drop in the bucket. Like 15% of global emissions are going to be, if everybody went vegan, we'd do 15% less, which is a lot. It's a huge amount, but it pales in comparison to everything else that needs to be done, right? So it's very misleading to call it a silver bullet. That's really misleading because that actually impairs action on issues that are important. That inhibits us from making rational choices about climate change because we think we've got it covered if we go vegan, and that's not true. So they're going back to Rip Esselstyn and they're showing these really big changes in their health markers. And yeah, if you go on a vegan diet, your cholesterol is going to get a lot better. It's going to get a lot better. I mean, it depends on your baseline diet. So if you eat a lot of meat, and then a lot of processed foods, not a lot of fiber, your cholesterol on a whole food, especially like a Rip Esselstyn type vegan diet, like a whole food plant-based diet, it's going to get a lot better, for sure. I mean, genetics are also important, though, right? So some people genetically are going to respond differently to dietary interventions, and to saturated fat and low fiber intake versus fiber intake and low saturated fat. They're all there's a big genetic heterogeneity here. But overall, you're going to get an important drop. And then the question is as well, I don't know, if you ask a low carber, it's like, is the postprandial glucose worth it? Because now you're eating a bunch of carbs in most cases. And I guess that's an open question. I know that LDL levels and ApoB levels are a really, really strong risk factor for cardiovascular disease, but how do they compare? And I think it would probably depend upon how metabolically healthy or unhealthy you are. So if you're very obese, it'd probably be, there might be an argument for being on more of a low carb diet, but I think that's still uncertain. Weight loss is going to be the biggest thing for people. Weight loss, and then watch your markers. You need to lose your weight, then watch your markers. If you can't get your markers down, increasing your fiber intake and swapping out saturated fats is going to be something that can help out your cholesterol a lot. And that's going to reduce your cardiovascular disease risk to a minimum. And you can do that without necessarily getting rid of all meat. You can just eat it healthier. Okay, so they're going back to this MMA stuff. So they're going back to his house. His dad. Ooh.
Bruce Lee understood that the quest for truth is only useful if you're prepared to take action for what you find.
It's best to lead by example. Most people say, oh, I just can't become leader. I said, you're right, it's a process to it. How do you guys do the meetings on it?
People have this idea in their head that they're going to do something. It's an all or nothing approach, and that's not the case at all.
If you go to people and say, you must not be me. They say, fuck you. Fuck you to tell me about me. But if you explain it, say, hey, why don't you try once a week? So, you could be. Years ago, no one talked about, hey, maybe you should just eat broken vegetables. But now, there's many athletes, professional athletes in all kinds of different sports that have done extremely well staying away from animal meat. They all feel weight, they all look weight, and why is it? The most important thing is not having a life story. I've been doing this great in my whole 32 years of my life. This is our best season in the last 15 years.
So they're just like talking, they're doing stories now. They're just talking about how people are going vegan, you need to change things. Arnold said like maybe try once a week. I think it's good. Try once a week, not eating meat. It's not a bad idea for a lot of reasons. But
Everybody's talked about the defensive line and this diet.
I'm talking about the Titans, how the Titans are all vegan and they're succeeding.
By the time Scott reached Mount Kentucky, word of his perseverance was released aloud in droves. But after 46 days and nearly 2,200 miles, Scott had only a few hours left to break the record. This will be the heaviest weight that anyone has ever carried on their shoulders. Patrick will be attempting 555 kilos, which is 1,224 pounds. This is an official Guinness World Record.
Wow.
The potential of the human body is immense. You can come out of some of the deepest, darkest holes and keep pressing forward. Let's do this. Scott Jurek is one of the world's most accomplished ultra-marathoners. His latest quest, the Appalachian Trail, may take to most hikers 5 to 7 months. Jurek did it in 46 days, 8 hours, and 7 minutes. 3 hours faster than the previous record.
It's not about being the strongest, the biggest. It's really about what are you going to do with your strength? What are you going to do with the power in that?
It's a good ending. I like the ending. All right, enough of my chatter. I hope you guys enjoyed it. See you guys later.